Hello, BookTube, and it's Friday again, and here's a video with a short Friday reads and what I plan on reading next week. But also, I'm going to show a few more books from um, my May haul, in a sense, that came yesterday. Was it yesterday? Yes. Maybe yes. Yeah. No, Wednesday it came. Sorry. Time is time is fleeting. And it's I'm gonna show a few books by a specific writer. So, but before we get to that, we'll get to what I've been reading. Now, I for my book to film this Saturday, tomorrow will be based on The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson, 1959 novel, and the cover. This is a Penguin edition, yeah, Penguin edition, and it's the Netflix series that's supposedly based on the book, but I have not seen it. But from what I have read about, it's not based; it's inspired by this. I wouldn't say it's based on it, but anyway, but the first film in 1963 was The Haunting by Robert Wise, and that's well, he's the director. Sorry, it starred Claire Bloom, Julie Harris, Richard Johnson, and Ross Tamblyn, and that's 1963. I'll be talking more about that. And then in 1999, they remade the film um, The Haunting, with uh, Catherine Zeta-Jones and Liam Neeson. And I'll talk briefly about that if I have time in my video as well. What's coming up to read is for the following Saturday, my book to film, which is going to be The Innocents. Jack Clayton directed Deborah Kerr in the film in 1961, and it's based on and there's the film there. That's the BFI Blu-ray of it, and it's based on Henry James's Turn of the Screw. It's a novelette. It's very short. It's about 125 pages. I also have the somewhere along the line I'd got the Oxford World Classics of it as well. But this is the Turn of the Screw and Other Stories. Um, that's probably why I got it. If I remember right, I had this by itself, and then I saw this, but I wanted the other story, so it doubled up. But there's some there'll be good introductions and critical material in it. Also, the BFI Film Classics Guide to the Innocents by Christopher Frayling. This is the newer edition. And then a wonderful viewer sent me this. It's a sort of a biographical, but more professional of Jack Clayton, the director, by Neil Sinyard. It's a British film makers series. Um, this doesn't have a jacket, but I don't think. Well, probably the first few probably had jackets, and then later the others did. And this is Manchester University Press. Was printed in 2000. So that's the first one. So now let's get to the books. Now, it's an author called I.F. Clarke, Ignatius Frederick Clarke, also known as Ian Clarke. He was born in 1918 and died in 2007 or 2009. He was an academic at the University of Strathclyde, or is that Strathclyde University? I get them always mixed up because some universities say University of, or name of the university. Anyway, Strathclyde, at the head of the English department. During the Second World War, he was in the British Intelligence Corps, and he had an interest in sort of future stories, sort of science fiction to an extent, but not all are science fiction per se. And he had great interest in future wars. And he wrote a number of books and edited. I don't have the edited. There's an 8-volume edited edition, Pickering and Chatto, of future war, like future stories. A lot of them future war stories from the 18th and 19th century. It's an 8-volume set. If anybody wants to give it to me for Christmas, I'll be very happy. But it's a very expensive set. It's upwards of 80, 70, 80 pounds per volume, and it's now the those cased, ugly print-on-demand, plasticized covers that are cheaply made, but charging a lot of money. But yeah, and he was interested in that. He edited those. Him and his wife translated French 19th century sort of future war stories and future like proto science fiction, I guess you could call it. But he started, like, he's written a number of books. This is a second edition, or it's called new edition, but it's the second edition of his Voices Prophesizing War. Originally, it was done in 1966. The dates here are a little, the originating date is correct from the first one, but the second date is not. Let me see, do they say what the... Yeah, the original was Voices Prophesizing War, 1763 to 1984. Now, the revised second edition is Voices Prophesizing War, Future Wars, 1763 to 3749. And this is Oxford University Press. And it was published 1992, the second edition. And I'll just, the easiest way is to read a little bit from the flaps here. This one, Voices Prophesizing War. The literature of future wars is an exciting and popular genre, embracing classics such as the War of the Worlds and mass market bestsellers such as the Amtrak Wars. Here, sci-fi meets the spy thriller, the war novel meets the novel of dystopia, quality fiction meets the bestseller. Orwell's 1984, Erskine Schindler's The Riddle of the Sands, and Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451 are typical in combining critical and commercial success. This new edition of Voices Prophesizing War shows how the genre developed, accounts for its success, and describes how it is still changing. The first examples of such fiction are as much concerned with politics as with war. The anonymous Reign of George VI, published in 1763 and set in 1918, describes the triumphant imperialism of an English monarch who still leads his troops into battle on horseback. A century later, the first recognizable classic of the genre, The Battle of Dorking, played on the theme of unpreparedness for war, describing a Prussian invasion of the British Isles, imaginary invasions of the French, Germans, Americans, Russians, Soviets, and of course Martians followed in huge numbers. Throughout the 19th century, novelists wrote with increasing sophistication on the technology of war, often as in the case of Conan Doyle and H.G. Wells. They were in advance of the generals and scientists, and their prophecies were fulfilled in terrible fashion by 2 world wars. Taking a few liberties there, but okay, I get the idea. Great cover. Then he came out, and then in 1966, that was 1964, 66. This one's 1979, published by Jonathan Cape, and it's The Pattern of Expectation, 1644 to 2001. Some fading on the spine and covers, but that's okay. This one, discussion of the future is a working tool for some and a plaything for imagination for others. In this remarkable book, the result of 25 years of research, Professor Clark traces the evolving pattern of prediction. He shows how the factors making for change in a society, political, social, technological, philosophical, decide the pattern of expectation from generation to generation. That wasn't very well written. Oh well. Anyway, Professor Clark discusses the many factors that have worked together to make the story of the future a dominant form of fiction, written for every kind of purpose, from the prophetic vision of H.G. Wells and the adamentary projections of Huxley and Orwell to the delightful entertainments of the science fiction writers. Stories of the future provide a way of imagining, describing, and playing with the newfound potential of the applied sciences. From the early 1800s onwards, this form of fiction developed rapidly. Future wars, ideal states of the future, scientific romance of the future. The first peak came about 1870 with the early romances of Jules Verne and the Battle of Dorking by Sir George Tompkins Chesney, which alarmed the British and astonished the continent with a vivid account of a German invasion of the United Kingdom. Thereafter came the first attempts at social and technological forecasting. So this one is very good. I've read this one many years ago. Let's put it that way. Then comes two sort of omnibuses or collections of that type of material. I have not seen the 8-volume set that he did, but I'm assuming these next two probably are excerpted from there, if not in full, or at least in part, I would think. These ones I have not read everything from. I've got these two while I was in the UK here recently in the past few years. So I've only dipped into them and they sort of got on a pile. This is The Tale of the Next Great War, 1871 to 1914. And it's fictions of future warfare and battle still to come. It's edited by I.F. Clarke, Liverpool University Press, 1995. This is part of their Liverpool Science Fiction Texts and Studies. General editor at this time was David Seed, and series advisors, he was one of the advisors. Brian Staberford was an advisor as well. And this one, just briefly of the flap. This selection of short stories offers a return journey through the future as it used to be. Time speeds backwards to the 1870s, to the alpha point of the modern futuristic fiction. The opening years of that enchanted period before the First World War, when Jules Verne and H.G. Wells and many able writers delighted readers from Sydney to Seattle with their most original revelations of things to come. In all their anticipations, the dominant factor was the recognition that the new industrial societies would continue to evolve in obedience to the rate of change. One major event that caused all to think furiously about the future of the Franco-German War of 1870. The new weapons and the new method of army organization had shown that the conduct of warfare was changing, and in response to that perception of change, a new form of fiction took on the task of describing the conduct of the war to come. Imaginary wars in this collection of 16 stories, extensively illustrated with carefully chosen contemporary drawings, are powerful reminiscence of dominant expectations as these were perceived and projected during a fateful period of history. Old antagonists and once flourishing alliances are here restored to the full life of fiction. They are venerable echoes from the last age of innocence before the military technologies in the First World War demonstrated that the most brutal ways that the unexpected can make nonsense of assumptions about the future. And as it says, there's 16 stories. There's an introduction for him, the Paper Warriors and their Flights of Fantasy. That's by Clarke. And then we've got the reminiscence of the Battle of Dorking by General Sir George Tompkins Chesney. And the Battle of Dorking, that's about him, I guess, sorry, yeah. And then the Battle of Dorking itself, Der Ruhm, the wreck of German unity, and the narrative of Brandenburger Hauptmann, 1871, and so on. It just goes through. And the next one is very similar. It's a collection called The Great War with Germany, 1890 to 1914. also edited. It's a bit larger. It's almost 450 pages. Another University of Liverpool University. See, I never get them right. Never get it right. So it's a great war with Germany, 1890 to 1940. Fictions and fantasies of war to come, and it's one of the Liverpool science fiction texts and studies, published in 1997. In the second of a series within a series of anthologies on future war stories, the leading specialist in the field presents a selection of prophetic tales about the conflict to come between the British and the Germans' tales, which had immense influence on the quarter century before the First World War. An extensive range of contemporary illustrations is included. Although the accounts of naval engagements, land campaigns, and invasions in the selection belong to time past, all their authors began by looking into the future, despite the decided animosities and once separated the authors of those tales of the not yet. One common aim made them penfellows of a kind. They accepted without question that it was their duty to anticipate and describe the causes and the consequences of the next great war, which they were convinced would break out sooner or later between the major European powers. They were not, however, straightforward attempts to forecast the most likely course of the war in Europe. They dealt in the stuff of fantasy, and their authors offered their readers exciting tales of consequence. Professor Clarke introduces 37 extracts selected from the most representative British stories and German accounts. Together, they comprise a shadow play of the interactions between two different sets of expectations as the British and the Germans move forward from one international crisis after another to the fateful August of 1914. As a fascinating epilogue, we cross the Atlantic to read J. Bernard Walker's America Fallen. So yeah, so there's the 4 books. He also did a bibliography called Tale of the Future. This is the 3rd edition, much revised and added to. It's published by the Library Association in 1978, and the full title is sort of The Tale of the Future from the Beginning to the Present, 3rd edition, and annotated bibliography of those satires, ideal states, imaginary wars and invasions, coming catastrophes and end of the world stories, political writings, and the forecast interplanetary voyages and scientific romances, all located in an imaginary future period. That have been published in the United Kingdom between 1644 and 1976, collected and compiled by I.F. Clarke. In 1978, I say the London Library Association. This came out only in a paperback. This, as far as I know, this version. There was no cased or no hardcover version that I'm aware of. The first edition definitely had a hardcover, but it's a bit smaller. The annotations are very small. It's done chronologically, and then if there's many in a year, then it's alphabetical by author. But say, for instance, here, let's just see here. Ray Bradbury, The Silver Locust, The First Men on Mars and the End of Life on Earth, published USA 1961 as The Martian Chronicles. So that's the annotations. They're very brief, but it is an interesting bibliography because, as I was saying, it's sort of proto science fiction, but not everything is what many would call science fiction. A lot of it is, as I say, it's set in the future, and it's either political intrigue or wars. And the wars don't necessarily have to be scientific, and they're not science fiction in that way, but it's an interesting sub sort of genre of this kind of fiction in a sense. Well, it is fiction, not even in a sense, but it is fiction. But it's it's not all of it is science fiction. Some of it is, some of it isn't. It's just I find it interesting, and that's why that bibliography I find very good, because it brings those things together. You normally would not see some of those stories beside other ones. Like you can conceivably read War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells and then read something else that has nothing to do with aliens, Martians, but it's set in the future and it's a war, and those two can be parallel and read together because the ideas of what it's trying to say is similar, and it doesn't necessarily have to be science fiction. But how do you find those other ones? And Clark did this. He did it extremely well, and I would love to have the 8-volume Pickering Shadow. I saw it many years ago, and I've never seen it in person. I should say I seen it listed, and then it was too expensive at the time. It was proper, the cloth bound ones. It was like £300 or £400, and I couldn't afford it. Maybe not quite that much, but I could never afford it. Now it's available, but in cased reprints, probably print on demand, in these horrible, ugly, plasticized, cheaply made hardcovers, and they're about 80 to plus each. I don't even think all of them are still in print. But the ones that will be cheap reprints, and may not be fully print on demand, but it's just cheaply made. But I wouldn't say no to a set. So Christmas is coming up. Hopefully I've been good to Santa, or been good, and maybe Santa will look favorably on me. The only problem is my chimney is blocked off. The fireplace is blocked off to the chimney, and then I've got my film books in front of it. It's gonna have to work bloody hard to get in here. Anyway, take care, BookTube. I will see you tomorrow with the book to film of The Haunting. Take care.